Welcome to the Transplantation Podcast. My name is Dr. Macey Levan, and today we're going to be talking about the engine of discovery for our field. It's federally funded research, especially through the National Institutes of Health in the United States. Our conversation centers on the paper that was invited to the journal called Federally Funded Research in Transplantation, Achievement, Strategy, and Vision. It's a panoramic look at how public funding has turned ideas into clinical realities and where unmet needs still are. So there are three phenomenal voices that are joining me today. The paper's author from Northwestern University, Dr. Satish Nadig, Dr. Anita Chong from the University of Chicago, whose work has shaped our understanding of transplant tolerance and in memory, and Dr. Jonathan Bromberg from the University of Maryland, who is renowned for his discoveries on regulation and lymphocyte tracking that underpin tolerance. You guys have been, you guys might have to unpack some of those for me because they're very important. And I thank you all for being here. So let's start with Satish, with the thesis of your paper. In a few strokes, what has federal funding made possible in transplantation? And what does the field look like with or without support?
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to my colleagues, Dr. Chong and Dr. Bromberg, who are pioneers in the field in their own right. I think the fact that we're having this conversation is a testament to how young the field of transplantation is, frankly. Next year, it'll be 72 years old. In fact, in just 2 months, it'll be 72 years old. And I think really the push for transplantation came from the science of immunity and the science of alloimmunity. And much of that was federally funded, especially after it was legitimized as a field in the mid-1980s with the National Organ Transplant Act. The basis of our entire field is based around the community or the public's trust in the healthcare system. We wouldn't have a job unless people donated their organs on life or in passing to people they often don't know. And so that there's a foundation of trust there. The science of that is must be peer reviewed, and it must develop that type of trust. And that trust comes from the gold standard, which is the National Institutes of Health. So what has the National Institutes of Health done? Well, it's allowed for us to enter what we now are in, which I call the renaissance of transplantation, where we're talking about things like tolerance, we're talking about things like xenotransplantation, and we're talking about things like machine perfusion, and then translating them into the clinical realm. So much so that it's becoming really on the world stage, where just a few weeks ago, Shimon Sakaguchi won the Nobel Prize for regulatory T cells with his two partners. Those particular cell types are in clinical trials now in the setting of transplantation, much of which the work was funded by the NIH. And so I think these ideas of tolerance, these ideas of machine perfusion, the ideas of minimizing immunosuppression or being able to have personalized immunosuppression, a lot of those ideas had their roots in NIH funding.
So that's really interesting to kind of go back and think about how NIH funding has supported transplant research from the very beginning and has gotten us to where we are today. You've given some examples already of how the NIH has supported these ideas from bedside. So, Dr. Chong, your work really has been pivotal on tolerance and immune memory. Can you explain to me and our other audience members who may not understand what this means? And then talk about what did federal support unlock scientifically that wouldn't have been possible otherwise?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So I want to say that for me, NIH funding over the last 30 plus years has been absolutely instrumental in our ability to continue working on this area of transplantation tolerance, the ability to accept grafts, alter the immune system, acutely so that you don't have to take drugs for the rest of your life, that this alteration is at least sustainable, for a long periods of time and allows the grafts to function. And for me, I've received many different types of NIH funding, but I think that the most important is the sustainability of this funding so that we can keep a stable research team and build on findings that we make, year after year. And I think one clear illustration is my collaboration with another investigator at the university, Dr. Allegre. We have a 13-year plus program project that we work collaboratively that allows us to take some intellectual and technical risks. And this has allowed us to tackle the problem of sensitization, immune memory, and then incorporating our understanding of immune responses to the allograft and mirroring that with studies of immune responses to pregnancy and this intersection of pregnancy, sensitization, and transplantation and how to deal with these issues. So I want to just end by emphasizing how important NIH funding is, when you run a lab, an independent lab.
Yeah, let me dive a little bit more into that. I also work in transplant science, and I understand and appreciate the importance of needing to support our labs and our people. But can you also talk to us a little bit about how maybe you've been affected by any changes to the NIH? Or are things pretty much stable for right now with your lab?
I am very fortunate to be in an institution where everything has been stable and not significantly affected.
But I'm seeing colleagues around the country who may have had different challenges with that. And so I think it's really important to remember that there is stability, but there's also places where there's not stability. And in order to make sure transplantation and the research surrounding transplantation continues to advance, it needs to be stable for everyone.
Yeah, I think Dr. Satish has something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a very unstable time now in my institution. As many know, we're on a federal funding freeze. Our institution has been kind enough to be able to bridge some of this funding, but now we're in the middle of a government shutdown as well, and so that can just keeps getting kicked down the road, and ultimately it makes something that is, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this as well, but it makes something that's hard as it is to attain even harder. And then once you've attained it, that uncertainty of when that's actually going to be realized makes it very difficult to keep science ongoing. And especially when you're a clinician scientist and there's other forces at play that are pulling at your time. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now, which can certainly cause angst, not only in the individual, but in the institution of transplant research as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So let me move to Dr. Bromberg. Your program has really reframed how we think about some of these issues, like cell trafficking and immune regulation and transplantation. Can you explain that and then kind of talk a little bit about how that sustained funding from the NIH shapes the arc of those discoveries?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for putting on this podcast. I think it's very important. So firstly, the NIH funding allows you to do things like ask a big what if question. And big pharma, small pharma, biotech, they don't have the ability to usually ask what if questions. They can't ask things that are really theoretical. They can't ask things that are way out there that hasn't been done before because they've got their own funding problems and really need a product right away to try to get something commercialized. The NIH is very different. It allows you to ask other kinds of questions and investigate those, from the molecular to the animal to trying to translate that into human cells and eventually maybe into humans. And it's this funding that is unlike any other funding from the federal government. Maybe NSF is somewhat similar. Maybe there are certain components of the DoD funding or FDA funding that can also let you ask, what if questions, but nothing nearly approaches the NIH. And of course, the NIH stands out in comparison to any other country in the world. We're just head and shoulders and orders of magnitude above, the type of funding and the way the funding is given and the fairness of that funding. Well, the next aspect of that funding is sustainability. Science and the education and training in science, I think, is unlike almost any other industry. It's not like a retail store down the street. It's not like a small business where there are thousands and thousands of other small businesses. Once you have a lab up and going, you need to maintain the stability of that laboratory, the physical stability and the personnel that are there, all of whom are extremely highly trained. Even our quote unquote lowest level technicians usually have a half a dozen or a dozen more years of incredible experience. And once those people go away, you can't recreate that pipeline. So with stability right now, our institution has many pockets of instability, and the government shutdown has created more instability in terms of keeping our students and our trainees here, keeping our postdocs, technicians, junior faculty here, and keeping them engaged and continuing their careers and their education. Now, I think if you put it this way, if you were an 18-year-old right now and trying to figure out what you're going to major in college and what you're going to do next, do you want to go to, for example, business school, law school, or medical school, or graduate school? Well, right now the choice, unfortunately, looks like I'm not going to go to medical school or business or graduate school because there aren't any opportunities anymore. And maybe that'll change in a few years, but this pipeline is very, 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 very precious. And the NIH has allowed us to do this. Now, with regard to my own research, the lymph node, the really neat thing about the immune system in comparison to every other organ system is the cells move around and they move all over the place, and one part of the body to the other. Neurons generally stay in place. The stomach is always going to be in one place. Your lungs are always going to be in one place, but the immune cells go all over the place. And it turns out this movement is really, really important. We've filed about a half a dozen patents through the years on various aspects of this moving around. We actually have, in collaboration with one of my great collaborators down at University of Maryland College Park, have set up a company to take a look at some of the technologies we have developed in order to use the lymph nodes to our advantage to create immunosuppression and tolerance, and in this case for some autoimmune diseases. So it's been a great ride so far. Hopefully things will be back up and running in a few days, and the NIH will remain the star of research of the universe.
I love that. It's clear to me that the sustained public investment in transplant science is the power that keeps us moving and creating new advances and saving lives for patients. And certainly, you mentioned that the NIH is a fair environment, and it's a little bit different than industry-sponsored work, where we have investigator opportunities to initiate scientific inquiry. And I think that is incredibly unique, precious, and we need to make sure we sustain that public investment. So let's move to another spot about the NIH. There have been some delays with study sections meeting and some other things that were from the government shutdown that occurred earlier this season. But can you talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing with pay lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had the privilege to serve as the inaugural chair of the Immunobiology, Transplantation, Alloimmunity study section for transplant, which is fantastic. I mean, transplant has its own study section now, which is really a testament to the field itself and where the field has come from, where it's going. But it brings with it a lot of challenges, and the challenges are, to me, very stark because I deal with it every single day, which is there's no, and I'm going to piggyback on a little bit what Dr. Bromberg said here, there's no incentive really for clinician scientists to push through and be steadfast in getting NIH funding, mostly because the forces within the clinical realm are dealing mostly with finances, revenue, RVUs, et cetera. And so there's a lot of pressure on clinician scientists to be more clinician, less scientists. And coming from somebody who went through, I'm lucky to be NIH funded my entire professional career, going from K to R to U, really growing up through the system of NIH funding. But I've also had the fortune of being involved in industry funding as well. And on one hand, industry funding is very observational, really wants to push to the clinics immediately, whereas NIH funding is focused on the mechanism of how things work, that really lays the foundation for the growth of a field, yet it takes work and it takes persistence and it takes time. And it right now is more competitive than it used to be 20 years ago, I would say. And so that coupled with a new generation of clinician scientists that have more immediate satisfaction with the clinical world is not incentivized for early career scientists, specifically clinician scientists, to be successful. Now, what I will say is I think the NIH recognized this, and they've converted to the 3-score system of the factors, which does not actually score the investigator themselves, but just comments on whether they are appropriate to do the work or not. And I think that actually will allow for early stage investigators to be more brave and braver in actually applying for these R-level fundings, because a lot of departments of surgery aren't really supportive of K-level grants, frankly, especially in the surgical world. More so in medicine, less so in surgery. So I would say field competitiveness and a disparity between early stage and established investigators. It's not a secret that many people who have multiple R01s continue to get R01s, and but it is much more difficult to get that first one, especially as a clinician scientist.
Yeah. Are we seeing any differences and changes with the early stage investigator pay line pathway?
Is that to me, the question? Yeah. So I think that there's been a concerted effort to push early stage investigators in both the American Society of Transplant Surgeons and American Society of Transplantation into more NIH-based funding. And I think that for that reason, I think we're getting more and more people interested in it. I will say, as a sort of support of the ASTS, the American Society of Transplant Surgeons had their first surgical scientists career development conference that was held at Duke just a couple of months ago. And it was well attended and people are interested in doing it. I think that's part and parcel of the fact that the NIH has shown that they want to have more early phase investigators involved in research funding.
That's wonderful. Dr. Chong, you've talked about your lab. So can you sort of talk to me about what you think is a choke point for these early stage investigators in getting involved? Is it the funding? Is it mentorship? Is it protected time or something else? How can we make this better for this group of folks who want to be involved in science?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think firstly, protected time from the clinic. I think trying to get the appropriate mentorship committee that helps them not only find time, but also identify the important questions and provide them mentorship of how you build a research team. And I think that in addition to that, and for all of us, whether you're PhD or clinicians, it is to balance the amount of research time or work time with lifetime and life responsibilities, because this is a very, very competitive business. The funding pay lines are tight, and you have to be in the top 10% year after year, proposal after proposal. And so trying to balance this and finding the right questions, keeping up your productivity. And so I think that all of us have, life problems, failed high-risk projects. And so on top of that, having institutional support and NIH support for bridge funding is really critical. And there were multiple times in my life where I was down to almost no money. And I got bridge funding from, the program, the transplant program at the NIH. And that was absolutely essential. Otherwise, if I lost my team, I wouldn't be here. And I think that the last thing I want to emphasize is how quickly new technologies are just, flooding our field and transforming the way that we're doing science. And and you can't acquire all these really complex technologies just by yourself, and that the ability to collaborate, to be in an institution where you can collaborate or to reach out to another institution so that you can bring in these new technologies and to keep moving. I think it's just absolutely essential. And so getting young investigators to be able to network as well as build your own program is, I think, very essential for longevity.
That's a really great point. I fully agree. Okay. Dr. Bromberg, let me ask you about this. Let's talk about the translational pipeline. In your experience, what makes translational research stall? Is it, the lengthy IRB processes, institutional review board stuff? Or is it from the manufacturing side, from multi-site coordination of studies? I know that's really difficult. I think in the there's a U mechanism for things like that with the NIH. So from your perspective, what makes it stall and what can we do to make it better?
I think it stalls because it's very difficult. There's multiple steps. It's quite difficult, and there are very few people trained to do all of these steps, right? There are mechanisms from the UNIH like UO1 type of mechanisms where they want you to translate. But it's you as the researcher have to be able to develop all the various steps from taking your product, whether it's a cell or a molecule or whatever, to the next step of efficacy with a human model and then toxicity testing. And while many universities also have various offices and departments and institutes that help with this, the universities also have to kind of recreate the model for each individual product. And some are better at others, but it's almost like you're being asked to form an entirely new business. It's never been formed before because it's probably a novel disease and it's a novel cell or molecule and it's a novel approach. And so you end up, maybe going through the SBIR, the STTR, but again, you have to set up every single path along the way. Again, there are some people out there that have done this multiple times and therefore become experts. There are some individuals out there who might not be members of university or NIH who are experts, but it's not widely available knowledge and ability to do this. And I think maybe what universities need to do is get together and maybe do this with various components of the NIH and say, how do we streamline this? How do we make this regular so that every single investigator, every single university can take their discoveries and take it to the next level without having to recreate all this and take years and years and kind of truncate this. Now, of course, you still have to do the research. You still have to prove safety. You still have to prove efficacy, and I've not found that the IRBs have tended to block this. I've not found that the FDA per se or other regulatory agencies have blocked this. You really need the depth and breadth of research. And it's the difficulty of coming up with something that's completely new. I think the three of us here are all really good at doing research, at doing basic research. I think we're good at, if a company comes to us and say, hey, we want to do a phase 1 or 2 or 3 trial, the company's already put a lot of time and effort into that. And we just kind of sign on and maybe help them tweak the trial a bit. But, it's all those in-between points, and I've had some experience with this now with this company I set up with Dr. Jewell. It's been really difficult. The details of all the various components of setting it up, it's been about 4 years. Okay. And I think that anybody who does this probably has been through the same issues. And here again, this is why our pipeline is important. This is not like setting up a coffee shop. It's not like setting up a lawn service in your neighborhood. It's not even like setting up a software shop, that creates some new software or some new ways about thinking about it. This is really difficult stuff, biomedical engineering and biomedical research. So, maybe we need new ways of thinking about this pipeline and to streamline the pipeline, and that's going to be a public-private partnership. I also just want to add one other thing. We're talking about NIH and federal funding, but we couldn't have done any of these things without a lot of other funding. Philanthropy has been very important. The universities have poured enormous amount of money into this via philanthropy, via excess dollars from their clinical work. And of course, there's our societies. The societies the three of us are most familiar with are AST, ASTS, TTS, ESOT, whatnot. And there's been an enormous amount of support from all of these societies. And we couldn't have done what we've done alone just with the federal dollars, but we've needed all of these other resources.
Very good points. So now let me ask each of you, if you could pull one lever at the NIH, what would make the most change to our field, whether it's mechanisms for funding, whether it's pay lines, training grants, or any infrastructure change? What would you do? Let's start with Satish.
That's a tough question. I think probably pay lines. I think that it's become so competitive that, when you go through all these grants, they all look so good, and that the scores are so compressed that it just becomes one grant over another grant, and it's really difficult to distinguish between the quality of both. And if the pay lines were a little bit more generous, there would be, I think, more people would be interested in getting that early win. It's hard to suffer defeat too many times without being discouraged by it.
Good point, Dr. Chong.
Well, I definitely agree that funding pay lines being successful more frequently than a 10%, which means 1 in 10. I tell everybody, that it's a 10%, which means on average, a person has to submit 10 grants to get one of them funded. And that is, but I think that in addition to that, for me personally, thinking about making big changes, it is, we have focused a lot of our basic science on basic mechanistic studies and success. You want things to work. And I think that introducing into at least some of the mouse models, marrying the strength of the mouse models and making the mouse models, tweaking it so that it better reflects some of the barriers that we see in humans. And maybe not being able to achieve success, let's say in tolerance, but actually failures, which is exactly what we're seeing in humans, and then working from that. So I think tweaking some of the significance and impact to developing mouse models that harmonize with the human situation, I think is my personal sort of pitch.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Bromberg.
Yeah, for sure, pay lines. You can't tell the difference between a 1%, a 10%, and a 20% grant. They're all incredible, and the people and the resources behind them are incredible. And the advantage for the country is if you've got more incredible research going on at many different places throughout the country, you're going to have a better training and an educational environment, and you're going to have more people out there making discoveries. And you're going to find that there's somebody coming from left field because they got funded, and they're going to make some incredible discovery that nobody else found about, and it's going to have a huge impact somewhere in science and medicine and patient care.
Fantastic. All right. So let's move to our next segment and talk about strategy and vision. Primarily, what this paper is talking about is strategy and vision for the NIH for transplantation priorities. So what are the priority domains for the next 5 to 10 years that you've mapped out in your paper?
Yeah, so actually, it's interesting. There's obvious answers, which I totally support as well. And those answers are xenotransplantation, of course, regenerative medicine, artificial tissue development, tolerance, the ability to take big data, AI. All of these things are definitely things that are priorities. But I'm going to add one other priority that to me I see every day, and it's a big deal to me. That is a low-hanging fruit. When all of those things are being supported, I think we need to, in parallel, put a lot of support around the use of marginal or discarded human organs. 40% of organs today are being thrown away that are procured for transplantation. Those are human organs procured for transplantation. And I think we need to be doing better at transplanting human organs while we are starting to push forward with this next generation and next technologies that are out there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's our most pervasive problem, right? We have a donor family and a donor's decision that was honored and that gift, and we need to make sure we use that gift to save a life or to heal a life in the best way we can, as well as focusing on these new sources of organs and new ways of doing things.
Right. Methods of preconditioning, organ rehabilitation, et cetera, I think should also be very, very much in the conversation.
All right, Dr. Chong, let's talk a little bit about tolerance. What is the next experiment that you would fund if you were in charge tomorrow to, move things into elegant biology into something that is a predictable clinical protocol?
I think it's something that I had discussed earlier, which is to make mouse models more harmonized with the human situation, introduce memory, make it so that our starting point is not that we induce tolerance, because that's not what happens in humans. We want to start with a model that fails to induce tolerance, and then work, I think, from there. The other idea that I had is to introduce this idea of partnerships between PhDs and clinicians so that we better understand, so both people, people always say jack of all trades, master of none. But when you have people who are highly focused and specializing in very basic studies to working together with people who are highly trained in clinical, I think that synergy is much more powerful than one person trying to do, bench to bedside. And so having, funding mechanisms that really encourage this type of partnerships would be the two things that I would suggest.
Fantastic. What about you, Dr. Bromberg? What is the translational bet that you would want to see?
Well, I'd echo a lot of what Satish said, but maybe a slightly different flavor. We've got the tools now, but the tools are not matured to do the following. So one thing is biomarkers. We have lots of multiomics that we can get from biopsies, blood, urine, tissues, and to discover, is an organ good or not? Is it having a rejection or not? Is the patient in good shape or not? You can ask all of these questions, but we haven't really done the experiments and gone through the data. And some of this is doing experiments, and some of this is big data. And then taking that big data and using some program, maybe it's a large language model, and melding it with all of the other data that's in the EHR, the electronic health record, to really understand about the donors, to really understand about the recipients, and the whole longitudinal kinetics of the recipients. The next thing is, when Satish is talking about the donors, we are right on the cusp now of taking every single organ, putting it on a pump for many hours, if not many days, and saying, is this organ any good or not? Can we make this organ better? Can we fix the organ? Can we heal it? And then doing all of our donor operations at 8 o'clock in the morning, and all of the recipient operations a few days later, also at 8 o'clock in the morning, and everything's done electively. And all of the outcomes are really, really, really good and much better than they are now. Then we put on top of that what I was talking about with the biomarkers. You use them in the donor, use them in the recipients before transplant, and then you use them in the recipients after transplant to really get individualized care and decide what's going on with organ function, what's going on with ejection, what's going on with the immune system using our techniques. It's not inconceivable that 10 years from now, all the donor operations and all the recipient operations are going to be completely elective. We're going to do much better than we're doing now. We're going to have much better outcomes, right? If everything was done in the morning and all the organs worked right away, it would be so much better. And then we could really be talking about better immunosuppression and tolerance rather than, limping along.
That's incredible. So basically, science is changing practice in a way that is improving the lives of not only patients, but those doing the work, right? It's so much easier to do transplant operation in the morning than in the middle of the night, for example. Not that it's, not done and we do it all the time, but that lifestyle, really, that change, I think will encourage the next generation of transplant people to work in our field and to become transplanters, right?
And more importantly, it's better for patients, actually. You have more resources today. It's the nursing staff is fully staffed. It's just better for patients. The outcomes are better too.
It's just better all the way around. Cool. So let's talk about people and policy and public trust for, the last segment that we have here. Transplantation really sits at this crux of biology and policy, as well as public trust. And so how should federal funding address these issues of workforce and training with these early investigators and clinician scientists? as well as public trust and confidence in the research, and making sure that the research we do is actually translating into better and safer care for patients, just like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my mind, it's sort of threefold. The first is I'm going to echo what Dr. Chong and Dr. Bromberg said here as well. There needs to be more collaborative scientist grants. I think in this day and age, one person can't do everything. I know my entire career has been based around collaboratively working with other PhD scientists. And when we develop teams, when I hire somebody that's new and right out of training, I put a team around them. The first thing that I do is put a team around them of PhD scientists so that it ensures their success. So I think supporting more collaborative scientists so that we can actually support the early career scientists that are coming out, both straight scientists and clinician scientists. The second thing is I think there needs to be more emphasis around education of the public. There's a lot of misinformation and miseducation about transplant that becomes highlighted because it's very dramatic as a headline in a newspaper. Yet it's not actually based in reality. And when you drill down deep to it, what's actually the headline may actually be part of what happens in, for example, a donor after cardiac death, but it's not the public's not educated to that. And I'm going to go back to what I initially started by saying is our field is dependent on the trust of the community. So the minute we erode the trust of the community in transplantation, we have no way forward. And so there's got to be efforts from the NIH to help educate not only the people within the community, but also our lay public as well on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then finally, not only should there be collaborative efforts between scientists and education, but collaborative efforts between industry and academics and science. So the easier access to SBIRs, STTRs, taking some of the red tape out of that so that we can move late stage findings on the bench towards the bedside with an industry engine. So I would say my answer to that would be three-pronged.
Dr. Chong?
I completely agree. I think communication between the scientists, the physicians, and the public is so important because social media is how information is now spread, and I think all of us need to be better at doing that. And I think that this podcast is, one important way to reach out. I think that the second thing that I wanted to highlight was this AST survey of transplant recipient needs and understanding exactly not from what physician's point of view of what the patients need, but the patient's point of view, telling the clinicians what they need and emphasizing this, the burden of immunosuppression that is persistent life, for the entire life of the recipient, and how we as scientists can address that need. And I think that another thing that is a little bit controversial that I want to bring up is the contribution of the patients themselves, and how in the discussion of the impact, the significance of the signs, and whether there is an opportunity for at least the society to include these voices into, our platform of what is important and what we want to focus on moving forward.
Yeah, I'm a total fan of the inclusion of patients and their perspectives as they're valuable and experts in their own right. I think it's incredibly important. Dr. Bromberg, do you have a reply?
Well, I echo what they've said, but I'd also say that we need to have the research going on everywhere. We don't just need one big transplant center, in every region of the country. There's 250 transplant centers around the country, and we need to grow all of them so that we've got transplantation going on everywhere, transplantation research going on everywhere, and training going on everywhere for medical students, residents, fellows, postdocs, and whatever, because that's how you really get to the community, is that we're everywhere and we know everybody in the community and they know us, which goes again to this is where the federal government and the universities and philanthropy and the foundations and the society should be supporting all of this. It's not just going to be, being really good on whatever social media, platform, but it's being part of the community, because that makes a much bigger impact than a news statement, or a headline or something. That if you're really part of the community, and there's a lot of us out there that interact with thousands of other people every single year because they're all part of our communities, that's going to make a bigger impact than anything else.
So, what I'm hearing is engagement, paying attention, involving patients, all of these things, really having partnerships, collaborations are really important for the future of transplant science. Let's see here. Does anyone have any other thoughts they want to offer around engagement and involvement of the Transplantation Society or any of the other societies with federally funded research?
Well, actually, not only with the societies, but actually the plug that I would like to make is for more clinician scientists and more scientists to be engaged with the NIH. I find it very difficult, honestly. I serve as a associate editor for the American Journal of Transplantation. It's very difficult to find reviewers. It's as a chair of a study section, it's often difficult to get people engaged into study sections. And so the only way that we move the field forward is to be a voice of the field as well. And to be a voice for the field entails being involved in these sort of activities. So I would say beyond the societies with your transplant journals or study sections in the NIH is really important to be an advocate for the field.
Do you have any practical advice on how to get involved in that?
Well, for early stage investigators, there's early career reviewer programs through the NIH. That is a great way to get started. In fact, that's how I got started many years ago.
Fantastic. Thanks for the advice. So today we traced federal funding to patient lives and understanding mechanisms of science to things that are moving along in the clinic and helping shaping outcomes to ensure patients are getting the very best. So I would like to thank all of you very much for joining me today. I would like to start by thanking you, Dr. Satish Nadig, for your paper. You can read more about the paper in the Transplantation Journal. Thank you to Dr. Anita Chong and Dr. Jonathan Bromberg for clarifying and talking about your science and also about what the public investment has already really built in transplant science. And for all of you for sharing your vision on what it's going to take for us to finish this job. You can find the paper, Federally Funded Research in Transplantation, Achievement, Strategy, and Vision in our journal. And this podcast will be available on all sites where you get access to your podcasts. Again, I'm Dr. Macey Levan. Thank you very much for listening and being part of our community that will turn research into reality and better outcomes for patients. With that, we'll be done.